located in Cottage Hill, which is a locally historically designated, as well as a National Register. The owner is Carolyn Patton. The project team is Carolyn Patton and her husband Julian Worrell, and the contractor is Rampy Design, with Todd Rampy as the owner. The Cottage Hill Foundation, through Joey Brackner, actually nominated the 528 Clayton for this particular award. Okay. And these were the criteria for the award itself. Overall, impact to the historic resources in Montgomery, a contributing structure to the Cottage Hill neighborhood and its streetscape, and just how it actually contributed to the overall history and architecture of Montgomery. Okay. This is before the restoration at 528 Clayton Street. All the different items that they actually worked through on the project itself over the course of several years. Okay. One of the things that was most impressive about this nomination also is the total picture of everything that they did to it, the quality of the work that the contractor did, Todd Rampy, and they even went into sidewalks, landscaping, lawn, driveway. They took the whole picture in the streetscape into consideration. So we're very proud to have awarded this Historic Preservation Award 2021 to 528 Clayton Street. Dr. Bailey?
What I'd like to do, she has summarized what this plaque says, but I just want to read it. I'm just so impressed with what has been done. I'd like to read it. It says, the Montgomery Historic Preservation Commission proudly presents its 2021 Historic Preservation Award to Carolyn Patton and Julian Worrell for overall restoration in a residential project, 528 Clayton Street, done this 12th day of October 21, Dr. Richard Bailey Chair, and I'm presenting it proudly to our discipline in historic preservation and many other preservation areas to Mr. Joey Brack. Would you like to make a comment? I would.
Yeah, I think on behalf of Carolyn Patton and her family, in particular, Dr. Melanie Richburg and Mrs. Robbie Richburg Davis. This is a family residence. It meant a lot to them to work on this property, to keep it up because of its ties to their family heritage. And I think she would like for me to thank the commission and the city, and also her contractor, Todd Rampy. I know that she would want me to mention him. And I would like to say, on behalf of the Cottage Hill neighborhood, which, and Dr. Bailey wanted me to just say, it's the oldest residential neighborhood in Montgomery. It's immediately west of the downtown business district. It's very much a residential neighborhood. We love living there. We also thank Carolyn Patton and her family for doing such an outstanding job on this home, and it's a real asset to our neighborhood. And thank you again. Thank you.
We'd like to thank Mr. Joey Brackner for taking time out from his busy schedule to come out here this evening, and we'd just like to encourage all of our other neighborhoods to step forward and ensure that your neighborhood is recognized also. Contact someone on this commission, Ms. Christy Anderson, with the Land Use Division of the city, and see about nominating your neighborhood for a Historic Preservation Award. Thank you so very much, Mr. Brackner, for coming out this evening. We are so proud of the Cottage Hill neighborhood and all of those residents. And I know quite a few people who live in Cottage Hill, and we just want to say that we salute the residents of Cottage Hill. Our committee updates the sign committee, Dr. Dallas Hansler, Richard Bailey, and Ms. Camilla Broadnax.
Yeah, so we have 3 properties that have applied for a sign. The first one is 528 Clayton Street. The committee met and agreed that this property should be issued a sign. What else, Christy? Do we want to go into a little detail on each property or just announce our decision?
Do you all want to make recommendations and get approval from the HPC, or did we decide, I can't remember, did we decide that the committee's recommendation should stand? I know there weren't any questions on this one, but there are questions on the other 2.
I defer to the chairman on that. Chairman, do we take the recommendation of the committee as the end-all be-all, or do we need to move to have a motion by the whole and approval by the whole commission?
I think we can just say the commission is empowered, I think the committee is empowered to do that.
Okay, well then we have agreed that 528 Clayton Street should be awarded.
Was there any discussion about the name that they wanted?
I don't think we even noticed that.
Patton House. They have owned the property for 50 years, but most of that ownership is a non-historic period.
Why did they provide information as to why they wanted it named that?
Because it's been in their family since 1967.
68, yeah.
68. That's your
Well,
call.
my question would be, does that, just because there's been a single owner since 1968, is that of enough significance to warrant it being named Patton House?
If someone was coming to me and wanted to do a National Register nomination and the property was much older than the 50-year ownership, unless there was something significant about it, I wouldn't recommend the name.
See, I'm inclined to not provide the name Patton House along with the sign, because I mean, what's the value, intrinsic or otherwise? What has the house contributed to the history of Montgomery besides it being a historic structure, which is significant enough to warrant a sign, but beyond that?
Well, the city directory research I did, there was a long-term owner during the period that I had directories for, which was Mac and Mary Horrell. It's possible, if you wanted to acknowledge the work the Pattons have done recently and, maintaining ownership of this house, that it could be the Horrell Patton House, hyphenated, would be an option.
I'm a little more inclined. I'm a little more inclined to go that route. I mean, certainly.
Because that is a historic association, long-term. They were there for at least
About
40 years.
Well, so then we're talking
It was
90
probably-
years plus if we put both names on the sign.
Yeah, because they were the last occupants of the house, probably prior to the Pattons purchasing it.
I'm inclined to have both names on the sign, but I'd like to hear from my fellow committee members and what they think.
Well, I will say, on the application, their award application, one of their goals after the finishing of the house was to place an authorized historic marker on the property. So I would think that probably they think, it comes with their name on it. So I think they want their name. I mean, it doesn't say that, but I would assume that they're very proud of what they've done. And they did win an award for it, so.
Well, I would argue the sign is the prize, but I think a sign with both names on it, I think would carry more weight.
Yeah, I agree.
but I'd like to hear from Dr. Bailey and Kamala.
I agree.
How old is this house? I mean, it talks about the lot was 1895, or how long has the house been there?
It was probably built 1895, 1900. My city directories only go back to 1920, which is why that's my start date on kind of back tracing history of a property. Since I'm doing the applicant's homework for them, I don't really have time to go hunting for other directories to dig deeper than that. And with the exception of Cottage Hill, 1920 is really late enough to really get that early picture of residents in the neighborhood.
Yeah, I agree with that. The owners before that had been there the longest, prior to the patents, were this 40-year.
Right.
At least.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That they appeared in the directory in 1920 and were in the directory in 1960, and I have 5-year intervals. And in 1965, the property was listed as vacant. So they were there for at least 40 years. And it could have predated 1920, and it could have been occupied until 1964. But there's no other information. And sometimes I can find where people moved to determine. I think I did. Did I figure out they moved to a different neighborhood?
Honeysuckle Court, yeah.
Yeah, 1965 they moved to a different neighborhood. So they were still around, but they had moved on.
So, Dr. Bailey, what are your thoughts?
I'll go with the two names.
So that's what we want to do. Do they need to be notified of our decision? Or, I mean...
Yeah, well, I'll talk to him about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Is everybody in tune?
Yeah, I would table that discussion on that house until we know what they want.
So then the next property is the Trinity Lutheran Church and Parsonage, is that correct? It's both of them.
Both of them, yes.
We did have some questions about the addition. Christy and I spoke on the phone. Christy felt that it didn't detract from the integrity of the structure.
Correct. It's an educational wing that was added. It's added to the rear of the building, and it is of a scale that it's really secondary to the primary, the sanctuary portion, and original probably office portion of the church. So if it wasn't on a corner lot, you'd never know the building was there, because looking at it from the front, all you see is the sanctuary.
I mean, I'm of the opinion that it doesn't detract, and that, you know, when you consider, one, its value as a structure, and two, its value as in the civil rights movement, I definitely think it should have a sign.
What's the date on the addition?
I do not know.
Okay.
And the committee, we as a committee agreed that this property should be awarded a sign.
And I had spoken, Mrs. Malden is the one who made application for this. And I told her that all of that wouldn't fit on one sign, so we did talk about splitting that into two, so there would be one for the Gratz Parsonage and one for Trinity Lutheran Church. So we'll split that language up. I'll work with her on that.
Okay.
And this property is already listed on the Alabama Register of Landmarks and Heritage?
It is. They did that in the last year and a half or so. When they got that, they applied for a sign with us.
That's different from the Alabama Register of Historic Places, or is that what
That's what it's called.
That's what it's called?
It is.
So it's already recognized here in Alabama?
Correct.
Any other comments or questions on that property? Okay. And then we moved to our last property, which is 642 Felder Avenue. It was this property that the committee had some questions, in particular about the columns.
And your question is, added or?
There are a couple missing. The most recent renovation has reduced the number of front columns from 6 to 4.
Oh.
There were paired columns on either side of the front entry, and then a single column to each end of the porch.
Oh,
And
okay.
somewhere in the restoration in 2018 and 2019, 2 columns disappeared.
Did
And I
they,
think the question is that a significant enough change? Does that throw off the balance, the style, enough to disqualify it?
Were they just floating out on the terrace, or? Where was the other set? Where they?
Hang
Oh,
on. I
on
brought
the
the
far,
file. I
on
got
the far
pictures.
corner of the terrace?
There were 2 side by side on either side of the steps.
Oh, okay. Not just
Oh, and here's
one,
a nice close-up picture of.
not just one. There is a close-up, but it doesn't show them. Oh, and then that one single up on the body, huh?
There's single on either end.
Huh. Oh, that's interesting.
oh, yeah, double column, okay.
Oh,
Yeah,
It ain't in here though,
yeah.
the one we have before.
right. Oh. It's kind of odd, though. This is not even, it's not evenly spaced between the outer 2, is it?
So
I can see why they left it off.
shutters have been an issue. I guess the question is, here we go. Now, I do believe that these columns have been replaced before. So that's what I see today. Oh, I think Joe Benton said columns.
What's the problem with the shutters?
Documentation submitted by the current owners show older real estate listings for this property and the column in there. The style may be different, but the paired columns next to the block, the front block, were there until 2018.
Till 2018? Until when?
2018, 2019, which is when these renovations started coming through the architectural review board.
Oh, that's,
This was not a change that we reviewed, but
But
it is
the-
a change that happened.
Oh, I see.
okay, so did the Architectural Review Board review?
No, not that.
Not that.
And, well, this might be a problematic question, because I don't want you to speak for the Architectural Review Board, but based on your knowledge of the Architectural Review Board and its decisions regarding changes like this,
Would they have approved it?
let's conjecture a little bit. Would they have approved?
Probably not, because that's a stylistic change.
Significant enough to warrant not receiving approval?
Yes, probably. They would want to see the same number of columns go back. And this is one, frankly, I missed. Nobody complained about it, so I didn't know it had happened until we went out and took pictures for this. I'm like,
Well, I
We're
would
missing
certainly like to,
two.
I would like to hear from the other members of the commission, perhaps some that have a little more experience.
Anyone?
I don't know if.
Carol, what do
more
you think?
experience, I don't know.
Anyone?
That's,
Carol, thoughts?
yeah.
Now, what Christie is
Dr.
saying,
Hanbury? Well, I tend to agree with Christie in that it's fairly stylistic. I mean, it's a fairly large change of the facade.
but mainly.
Significant, yeah.
Yeah, mainly Christian's saying that the Architectural Review Board probably would not
Right.
approve it.
Right, which even makes it
Right.
so.
So should we put this one to a vote then?
We can, yes.
Yeah,
Yes, but as I said, what Christian is saying is that the Architectural Review Board probably would not accept
Right.
this.
you know, earlier this year, there was one that got through because we were not understanding exactly what we should be doing. And this is something I think we need to look at carefully,
Okay.
if we're gonna start holding them to some standards.
In other words, you're saying we should not set a precedent.
We should not continue to set precedents of letting them go through.
Right.
Oh, I definitely agree with that. I mean, if the Architectural Review Board wouldn't have approved it, and we do, that puts us at odds.
Well, especially if it occurred during a period where the Architectural Review Board would have had a purview for it. The one you're speaking of, I think that door had been there for a long time, and I think it probably predated the district. So we didn't have the same type of issue because we're not sure when, we knew it had been there, but it didn't happen within the last few years like we know has happened in this case.
So I move that we put this to a vote by the whole commission as to whether or not this property should receive a sign.
Why don't you nominate the other two for signs and then just?
Well, we've already done that.
We already did?
You know,
Yeah.
there needs to be a vote at some point, but by motion, remember, we got that little thing that we need to do. But a motion to deny a sign to this particular property, I'll make that motion.
Second.
Any unreadness? Okay, all in favor to vote to deny, let it be known by a show of hands. Okay, motion carried. Thank you very much.
Okay, and we will, one of the reasons we talked about doing this as committee work was so we could have these discussions without having the petitioner have you all hash it out in front of them. So they will get a letter, and it will state why that petition has been declined due to the loss of the 2 columns that occurred during the most recent renovation. Like I said, the people who made application purchased it from the person who did those renovations. And thankfully, he's mad at me and the Architectural Review Board, so he says he's going to start doing renovations in McGee Estates. I'm like, great, go right ahead.
Okay.
Maybe you could suggest they put the columns back and then we give them a sign.
Well, I mean, I'll
And
tell them
reapproach it.
that because of the
Right.
loss of that, and
Right.
Now, that's an idea.
No, just to soften the,
Okay,
you
yeah,
know,
to
no,
put
you
it
can't,
back,
but if like, you know, we'd really like to see you
restore
restore, yeah, that very significant
So, I mean, I
feature
can include
and
that,
come
and
back.
I can include the photos that show what it looked like.
Right,
Because we want to give them an avenue to,
Sure.
Yeah.
yeah.
so that would be good.
Now, it does look better without the double column,
Right.
but
In other words, we want to offer.
Well, and then they might also be eligible for a preservation award next year because of.
They've restored a historic element, yes.
That's something to
Exactly.
include too. Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Dr. Dallas Henry, would you like to offer a couple of concluding remarks regarding the work of the sign committee?
I'll be brief. We were very efficient, and I'm proud of that.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much.
And I have come up with committee assignments for the next year, rotating our newer members into that. And I forgot to include it as part of this agenda, so you'll get it next time. Our next application deadline is not until March 1st.
Good enough. Okay, all right. Other business, CLG grants.
2 things related to CLG. One is if you've done any of the online training that I've been sending out, please let me know what you've done, because we have to do an annual report as part of our CLG certification to keep us current and recertified. So if you've done any of that, please email me and let me know what you've watched and who you are.
They're very good.
Yeah, they
They're
have
very
been.
good. And you can, if you can't attend the live, you can, does it count if you can, then 2 or 3 days later, you can register, and if you can't go to the actual
They're
live,
available for 60 days. Mhm.
then they will send it back so you can actually see the recorded, at your own
All right.
pace.
And they're going to try to do more of those, and they're free when they remember to send me the registration code. CLG grants, I was thinking about this when Dr. Bailey called asking if there were funds available to do a publication in relation to a marker unveiling. This first year, being a CLG, I think I would like to focus on education because it's required for you and the Architectural Review Board. But start thinking about types of projects that the HPC might do, or things, related like to your historic marker, where we may want to look at applying for grant funds to help pay for publications. We need to update our design guidelines. We need, there may be other education and outreach opportunities that but I think I would like to see us use this as a planning year. It was never worth doing before because I've been working on becoming a CLG since 2007. So I really wasn't going to put the energy into something that I didn't know was going to happen or not. And it finally did. So let's use this as a planning year to think of the types of things that we might benefit from some planning for. And they're supposed to open this grant cycle sometime in November. And when I get that, I'll send that to you just so you have a better understanding of the types of projects and programming this money will fund.
So why don't we put that on new business for November, December, then once those materials come out?
Okay.
So we have something to guide us as we discuss it.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting, and I don't know if you saw it in the comments of the reading architectural plans, that one CLG had gotten some funds to keep an architect at the ready to help homeowners with smaller projects. They're dealing with me drawing lines on photographs at this point, some of them. Just to have a little something to make it easier for folks to get through the process, which I thought was an interesting
That's a good idea.
use of funds. So when I get that, I'll share that and just put on your thinking caps and start thinking about what we might do. I've also printed off, and I didn't include it in your packet, I was going to bring it to show it to you. Huntsville, Historic Huntsville Foundation had done a scavenger hunt, and they had prominent buildings downtown, and it was kind of part coloring book, part word search with historic building terms, but also kind of pointed at different elements on the building that's geared toward, probably late elementary school students. Something, there are a lot of things that I think we could do that could have a good educational component to them. So that's all I wanted to say about that. That let's use this as a planning year. We'll focus on education with the funds we may be able to get this year, but let's think about things we might apply for in the next year.
Anybody has a question for Christy? A comment or question? All right, thank you very much. Moving right along, we have with us tonight another guest, and actually he's not really a guest because he's a piece of the continental part of the Maine, and that is Mr. Collier Neely, the Executive Director of Landmarks Foundation. We'd like for him to approach the microphone and let us hear some good news.
Dr. Bailey, I wish I had a lot of good news. But thank y'all for having me. I feel like the last time that I addressed this board, it was in the midst of a crisis with First Presbyterian. For the most part, I feel like we're in the clear there. And hopefully we can.
They're not asking to tear it down anymore, so
Yeah,
that's a positive.
And we've got lines in the water when it comes to finding developers and working with First Baptist to find a usable solution there. So I think we're in a good place there. But I kind of on the heels of this CLG conversation, just bringing some things to light to y'all, and then from the Landmarks Foundation and our perspective with community preservation and how that's a core tenet of our mission. Would like to extend a hand in partnership, one that's kind of already been there, especially with the preservation leadership classes. But as you're thinking about planning and as you're thinking about these education initiatives, a partner that can provide the network to engage the community, engage the historic neighborhoods, and those are in neighborhoods that should be historic, or should be considered historic through the National Register or the Alabama Register. But also, I'm here to bring up a few issues that are around these conversations about education and planning, especially preservation planning. Right now, the Landmarks Foundation, we're going through a strategic planning process, thinking about the next 5 years, thinking about what our preservation and community preservation mission looks like, but also thinking about what happens with Old Alabama Town and where we're going with the resources and the assets that we've got in that museum. And in thinking about those things and in having these conversations with the board and staff, I've really thought about like a solutions-oriented plan, something that looks forward, that takes the assets that we have and takes advantage of those things, but also works with the community to better serve the community's needs and be proactive when it comes to historic preservation. There are two specific things that are happening right now that, if they have not been brought to the attention of the Historic Preservation Commission, I think it would be valuable for you all to know about. The Retirement Systems of Alabama has a proposed building that they say they're going to break ground in November on the corner of Jackson and High Streets, diagonally from the Ben Moore Hotel and directly across the street from the Dexter Parsonage. And then there's the ongoing issue of the gas station, the MAPCO gas station in Cottage Hill, on Heron and Hall Streets and Clayton Street, right there in that block, and the demolition of the Stern Brothers furniture store, which is vacant at the moment. But at the same time, there should be conversations about adaptive reuse and turning the gas station around, and instead there's just
political pressure.
Yeah, political pressure, and there's processes in place that have been put together and endorsed by this board, under operation through that architectural review board, that folks feel that they can end around in certain cases. And I think the Historic Preservation Commission could provide a little bit of leadership when it comes to supporting those processes, making sure that those processes are up to date, but also engaging with the neighborhoods and the conversations about what good development looks like and how, possibly an RSA development could be positive for Centennial Hill in that area if the building was sensitive and not, some massive building that they're proposing. I think they're proposing an 8-story building. Is that right, Christy?
I don't know what
Okay.
but Dr. Bronner doesn't build anything small, so.
And Dr. Bailey, I know that you have spoken with Councilwoman Johnson about what's happening there with that particular block. I've had conversations with her as well. She seems supportive of the idea of conversations around what good development looks like. I think that is also the case when it comes to MAPCO, because that also happens to be in her district. But there's some other issues that are going on in terms of persistent demolitions in our neighborhoods. There's a feeling, at least on my part, that we're being reactionary to these types of demolitions. And then there's just the general development pressure in downtown. The best way for us to handle it as a coalition of folks who are supportive of historic preservation, who are protective of our cultural heritage assets, and who want to see Montgomery thrive at the same time, we've got a responsibility to better educate the community and tell them about these processes that are in play when it comes to reviewing, historic neighborhoods and work that's being done on historic buildings, and helping them see that these things are not about keeping people from making changes to buildings or keeping people from messing with historic buildings at all, but it's more about managing change and planning for change. Dr. Hanberry?
So they've owned that property for 20 years?
Which property?
RSA.
Yes.
Has anyone in those 20 years ever had a conversation with them?
I don't think so.
So maybe
But I don't know.
that influences how they view it? In other words, they're sitting there thinking, if it's so important, why hasn't anyone in 20 years come and talked to us?
We've
Yeah,
had
They
other
own a lot of
conversations with
undeveloped
RSA.
property.
There are other reasons for that.
It's possible, but the state agencies also enjoy a particular legal status that exempts them from zoning and architectural review, the zoning commission and the architectural review board.
They have sovereign immunity from local regulations.
So they do have to keep up with just particular code issues, but they don't necessarily they do not have to follow zoning regulations or historic designations. So a conversation about what goes there.
I guess I'm
and when
asking
it goes
how
there.
aware of the historical significance.
They're
of it.
aware. I mean, at this point, I don't see how you couldn't be aware
Well,
unless
but
you.
see, you can't, that's an assumption.
Sure, and I understand that that's an assumption. At the same time, when the National
So
Trust.
to make that assumption is quite dangerous if we're sitting here thinking they must know, and they might have no idea whatsoever.
They've had conversations have been had with the city by this point. They understand the historical significance of that corner.
Because of conversations.
Yes,
with the
because
city.
they've talked with Marcia Johnson and the mayor. Yeah.
And what are the outcomes of those conversations?
I'm not privy to the contents of those conversations, so I don't know directly what the outcomes are, other than they're breaking ground in November, or that's what RSA is saying.
Well,
We have had extensive conversations with MAPCO and given them extensive feedback on how they could make their project work in Cottage Hill. And they have opted to try to do an end run around the process. They're trying to be carved out of the historic district.
It's not just ignore the design review, they want to be mapped out of the district.
And they're
exempted
zoning.
from the form-based code, which is kind of the second best thing we have to historic designation and trying to get good form in new development. Because if they get the zoning they want and they get carved out, then they're going to be able to build whatever they want.
Well, it actually is carved out because they will be carving out the top of
Yeah, it's
The
going to
Cottage
require a
Hill.
lot of excavation.
a
Yeah.
massive excavation on
I did have
the
an
top point of Cottage Hill.
And these two things, along with the just significant development pressure that's happening in downtown, are not necessarily related to each other and what their potential outcomes could be, especially with the right politicking, for lack of a better word, but seeing it through a particular lens of what good development looks like. I think though the integrity of that area around the potential RSA development is jeopardized by an 8-story building being there, considering that it's going to dwarf everything else that's around it. But also understanding how difficult it is to change RSA's opinion and mind about how they build things, just given the other fights that the city and the community has had with RSA in the past. I think there's an opportunity to embrace the potential for putting feet on the street there, and the potential for plan changes and community action to encourage businesses and encourage good public investment along those streets, so it's safe for pedestrians, so that businesses feel like they actually are able to take advantage of the people that work there every day. And that can be the potential catalyst for revitalizing that neighborhood. And I understand that the city's got plans and grants and things that are moving in that direction, and I'm not privy to those things, but it could be seen as an opportunity. Whereas MAPCO is degradation of a historic district. It is chiseling away at the district itself, the National Register District and the locally designated historic district, and the exact zoning codes that we've put in place to offer easier paths for good development within downtown. And if you take that away, if you remove buildings and you offer an exception to the rule, then what's to stop someone from playing that game in the city core, in downtown, in the core, and tearing down, maybe not a historic building, but tearing down something next to historic buildings? And the process that has been put in place to help companies like MAPCO invest in our community in a sensitive way that benefits the community around, all the way around, is undermined. And it leads to bad development in the middle of nationally significant, globally significant places within our downtown core.
I'd like to return back to the RSA.
Property. So you said that there's been conversations between the city and RSA, but we don't know what the outcome whatsoever of those conversations.
They're breaking ground in November. That's the outcome.
Yeah, but that doesn't tell us what the conversations encompass, though. So it would, boy, it sure would be beneficial to know what the outcomes of those conversations were, because in crafting a strategy, that would be.
The Historic Preservation Commission, has a certain amount of authority and can get involved
Again,
here.
but I understand that, but how we choose to get involved could be dependent upon what the outcomes of those conversations were.
Well, I can tell you that there is a, Montgomery, through the Housing Authority, has received a Choice Neighborhoods Initiative grant that is it's to do planning studies for Centennial Hill. So, if there's a way to, I'm sure that process will end up looking at the impact of this as well. So it won't necessarily just happen in a vacuum, but that's a big impact.
Yeah.
At that scale, that's. I mean, you go to directly from like a super urban scaled building to a neighborhood of primarily 1- and 2-story houses with no transition.
I can certainly see expressing our concern about the impact on neighboring historic structures to what's going on with RSA. As long as what we do is just say that we have a concern that they be protected and not be swallowed up and with the change that we can't stop. I don't know like Dr. Henbury, I'm not sure when we do that.
There's no process for that, right? There's no public process or anything like that?
No, they don't. They don't have to go through
No,
any
they
of
don't
their
have to.
processes.
Yeah, they're outside, so that they
So-
don't entertain.
My understanding is that there is a possibility for a legislative process. That's all I know about it. But something can come from the legislature.
Well, then let's talk about MAPCO. Who decides to amend the districts, the land?
Well, that depends on whether or not it's done legally or illegally. Legally, this body would have to recommend that the District of Cottage Hill no longer meets the criteria for designation and make that recommendation to council and let them undesignate the district. There is no opt-out provision in any of our districts. Joe Smith buys a house in Cloverdale and decides he doesn't want to comply. You can't just opt out. That completely undermines the entire purpose of the historic protection. It's meant to be a long-term protection. So legally, it's an all or nothing proposition. Now, does that mean city council wouldn't just wave a magic wand and carve it out? They could.
Yeah, I recognize that they could. Because anything we do is subject to being overridden by them.
So even with the zoning change, if we can convince the planning commission to, if they take an action, if they deny it, if they recommend that it stay in smart code and MAPCO's not happy with it, their direct appeal is to city council because planning commission makes recommendations as well. So city council can override that decision at that point.
And the zoning change that they're asking for can open up that development, if it does go forward, to a multitude of uses if the gas station, doesn't stay open.
Yeah, that's right. It could be used for
There-
just about anything
For
they wanted
future,
to.
it's not a long-term. Gas stations are not a long-term.
And there were already issues that arose with the even rezoning. It's currently under a T4R transect, and even to rezone that to T4C, which is what they would have to do to be able to construct a gas station in that location, is considered spot zoning, which is something the Planning Commission isn't real excited about recommending, but that in this case, because we know calls are being made higher up, that I don't have any reason to believe that the city council wouldn't override that decision.
But ultimately, the reason I'm here is not to discuss the nitty-gritty detail of both of these events. It's to bring it to your attention, one, but two, point out that for too long, Montgomery has taken a reactionary point of view to preserving its historic heritage, its cultural heritage, and its historic buildings. And that has resulted in a city that is slowly losing integrity day by day. And it's resulting in a city that's trying to sell itself as one of the most historic places in the city, in the country, and arguably the world, that doesn't look historic, that doesn't have a historic character. And part of my responsibility as the director for the Landmarks Foundation, but also part of the Historic Preservation Commission's responsibility, is to make sure that people know what they need to do in order to preserve their city. Preserve the setting that they know, that they grew up in, and that they associate with the world-changing events that happened here. And I think that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, something that we can all kind of work towards as a coalition of folks interested in preserving our history, and that's through education initiatives. And the CLG certification that happened recently this past year is huge for us because it opens opportunities for us to engage the community, engage our policymakers, engage our politicians in a conversation about why it's important to preserve our cultural heritage and the landscape of our city and our community. And I think with the initiatives that Christy was talking about earlier, and creating things that help people identify places, whether young or old, is an excellent opportunity for us to push Montgomery's history towards, folks in the community. And there's a plethora of opportunities to do things. Before the pandemic, we started the Community Preservation Forum is what we called it. And we actually invited historic Macon and Newtown Macon to Montgomery to talk about what they've done in their city and how successful it was. And it even led the CEO for the National Trust to say if it can be done in Macon, it can be done anywhere. And that, y'all were invited to that, or when you were on the Preservation Commission at that point, if you were, y'all were invited to that. And it's actually sparked movement amongst folks in town. And several groups have gone over to Macon and worked with Macon. And it's even resulted in the Chamber of Commerce and their downtown plan engaging with Macon's planner, Interface Studios, who is one of the best planners in the country, and seeing the work that they've done in other places, not just Macon, was inspiring to understand, to see that our leadership in town has been able to recognize what a good consultant looks like, and to bring them here and be able to utilize those resources. And I just think that it's on our shoulders to push forward this, hey, this is who we are. If we're selling ourselves as a historic place, let's be a historic place.
Well, even for people who don't give a rip about historic buildings, Montgomery has done a really good job of accepting mediocrity. And you and I have had this conversation before, that if a big chain wants to come here, then by God, we've got to give them what they want. And the answer to that is no, you don't. You know, that there are some locations that require a little more thought, a little more sensitivity. For example, the suggestions that we never told MAPCO you couldn't build there. We suggested that the building front Heron Street so that the residents of Cottage Hill could walk and not have to walk across a parking lot to get to their convenience store, and they put the gas pumps behind it. That was our suggestion, to make it a workable plan, and they have resisted it at every turn. So we seem to be locked in this, well, we need the investment. We do. I'm not saying we don't, but we don't need it to be mindless or this is a gateway to downtown. It shouldn't look like every other interstate exit you can stop at on I-65. It just shouldn't.
And to that point, it takes a coalition to stand up and offer those solutions, not to stand in the way of development, but offer solutions to beneficial development. And I think that's where I come back to my message is we have a responsibility to educate the community and build that coalition. The coalition exists. It's there. It showed us that it's there in the First Presbyterian issue. But I think it could be better educated. I think it could be louder. I think it could be better informed and make better arguments that our city leaders will listen to and will help them see that there is a better path forward. So that's really all I have.
Before you take your seat, does anyone have a question you want to ask?
I don't have any
Comment?
questions.
Sure, go right ahead.
I'd like time to sort of think about these issues. I'm particularly concerned about the MAPCO situation, since it's just in planning stages right now. Then maybe we can talk about it in our next meeting if that's not too late.
They have delayed 2 submissions to the Architectural Review Board. They plan to move ahead with the Planning Commission at the end of this month, October 28th. And unless someone waves that magic wand, I anticipate they'll submit for our November 17th Architectural Review Board meeting. So we would have another meeting at least between now and when they would appear before the Architectural Review Board.
I'm a little aggressive on this. I would want to consider stating that we would be opposed to changes in the district. So changing the district lines. So we can talk about how we do it, but so that the Architectural Review Board knows that's how we feel about the sanctity of the lines for the district.
Well, that, at what point, then what's the process? In other words, wouldn't they have to come to, if they get denied at ARB, then they would decide to cut themselves out? And at that point, they would come to H?
They legally, they can't decide.
No, legally they can't, but.
I don't, their legal recourse is to appeal to circuit court.
If we denied it?
If ARB denied their petition.
Okay. Their petition
Or
for
resubmit.
design review. Okay.
I don't know. We have a good framework to stand on to justify that, and we also have a whole lot of documentation offering them ways they could make this project work that they have opted not to incorporate thus far. Haven't seen if they've made changes or not. I think we could have a good showing if we ended up in circuit court that we didn't just say no, that we really did try to come up, because, you know, Joey's has pointed out, you know, Cottage Hill's a food desert, you know, unless you want to wander across the interstate to the Chevron. And for several reasons, you'd be taking your life in your own hands doing that. So, you know, we're sympathetic to the desire for this type of business enterprise in this location. We just want them to turn the building this way and not have it, you know, with the gas pumps out front and which is also not compliant with the smart code, which is why they want to come out of that as well.
Christian, when is the next meeting of the Architectural Review Board?
Our next meeting is October 26th.
October 26th?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. What time is that?
5:30.
Okay, good enough. October 26th, anyone wants to attend? October
there's not-
26th.
Well, it won't be before them at that meeting. At the earliest, it will be November 17th.
November 17th, okay.
But the zoning committee meeting is the 28th
Is the 28th.
of October, so that,
Okay,
Yep.
all right. Any other question or comment from anybody? Okay,
okay, thank y'all.
thank you very much. And feel free to come back. Mr. Brackner, Mr. Neely, feel free to come back. You're welcome to come back. Okay, all right. Christy, anything else?
Thankfully, no.
All right. From our other commissioners, is there anything else? Okay, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Ms. Christy Anderson and Ms. Paula Wade for coming out tonight, and our guests and our other commissioners. There'll be no further business. The meeting hereby